How do you assess that, firstly? And secondly, do you see that happening over here as well, a more uneven distribution of power?
Well, first of all, it's really an honor and a pleasure to share the stage with Professor Stiglitz. And it is, of course, very hard for many of us here to disagree with any of the points that he has made so eloquently and forcefully. And when I listened to him, I was reminded of a column written by Tom Friedman in the New York Times just on October 29. And the opening line was, and let me quote it literally, where he says, "Not in the Cold War, not during Vietnam, not during Watergate did I ever fear more for my country." Is that a sentiment that you recognize?
Yes. Yeah, and I think it is a widely shared sentiment, and particularly because there are all these problems, and I didn't have time to talk about climate change. So we have other problems. I didn't talk about gun control. I didn't talk about all of the social problems, and yet we can't get our democracy to work to address any of these problems, and as far as most of us can see, they're getting worse.
What intrigued me is that one of your blueprint for fixing is what we would call social democracy. But then what we see happening here in Europe is that social democracy as a political system is in a crisis. Voters are running away, they're running to other nativist, anti-immigrant parties. So that's not the only solution, I would say.
Well, to get a society or an economy to function, you have to do lots of things. And if you make any major mistake, you're going to have a problem. Mm-hmm. And as you alluded to before, one of the things I think that Europe got wrong was the common currency. And
we got there.
Here we go again.
It's just 1 minute.
So I think it has acted as a dampener on economic growth, and things would have been so much worse in Europe if you didn't have your social protection system, if you didn't have your social welfare or your social democracy. I mean, can you imagine what things would be like if you had had the kinds of social protection that we have in the United States without access to health care? So I think one way of thinking about the European situation is how much worse it would have been if you had not had these various kinds of things that I've talked about that you need to keep society functioning.
Is it fair to say that the resistible or irresistible rise of Donald Trump to power is a nasty side effect of globalization?
It's part, but it's not an inevitable side effect. So, I mean, the question is, could we have managed globalization better? And it's not just globalization, because technical change and globalization would have led to deindustrialization, and a lot of the problems are the people who are deindustrialized have been left on their own. And a few countries, Sweden has managed this process of restructuring their economy with active labor market policies and industrial policies that have, I don't say, totally solved the problem, but haven't eliminated the angst, haven't eliminated a lot of the worries, but at least have mitigated them to the point where there's greater acceptance of globalization, at least.
Mm-hmm. Would it be fair to say that what's happening in the United States is a structural trend that will continue? Are we seeing the worst of the United States reappear on a more permanent basis? Or would you like us to believe that this is a temporary incident?
Well, I think we're at a cusp, because one of the consequences of Trump, you might say the silver lining, is an enormous burst of energy on the other side. So what I call, the progressive movement in the United States has never been stronger. So you see young people marching for climate change. You see a renewed concern about inequality, about monopoly power, real discussions about making sure everybody has access to health care. You'll see in some of the primaries in the United States what seems to be a lot of disagreement, but there isn't actually very much disagreement. Everybody believes that everybody ought to have access to health care. Everybody believes that you ought to raise the wages at the bottom. Everybody believes, there are other social issues that you ought to have gun control. So there is now, when I say everybody, on the Democratic side of, but if you do polling, it's still 60, 70% or more on this side of the ledger. So the debate has changed very dramatically, partly as a result of Trump.
And is the agenda that you're putting forward, is that actually the agenda that some Democratic hopefuls will be taking to the next election?
Yeah, I think so. I think in one way or other, all of them will be moving in that direction. Mm-hmm. And the debate is about the speed and the particular policies. For instance, access to universities. Some people are putting more emphasis on lowering the tuition, others about creating better student loan programs, or what combination of the two. But the idea that there should be better access to university education, I think is agreed among all the candidates on the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. And all the Republicans want to make it more difficult.
Mm-hmm. What happened to the Republican Party? I mean, you were there in the 90s as an advisor to Bill Clinton, so you were there when policy was being made, and you saw how difficult it was to actually change things.
Yeah.
Wages have been down for like over 40 years. So what happened that this decline hasn't, that you weren't able to reverse that during the Democratic period, and what happened to the Republican Party?
Yeah, that veers into judgments about what politics, how did the politics move. The defining moment, in a way, was 1994-96, that period, where Newt Gingrich, who became the Speaker of the House, put forward what was called the Contract for America. Some of us called it the Contract on America. But it was a enshrinement of notions of market fundamentalism, neoliberalism, and it was a commitment to the Republican Party to move in that direction, reduce taxes at the top. It was a continuation of the Reagan Revolution, you might say. The Reagan Revolution had not produced growth, so what was their response? Double down on that. Let's do more of it, and hope that if you lower taxes on the top even more, deregulate even more, maybe it'll work.
Mm-hmm. But in all fairness, two Democratic presidents sat in between.
Yes.
Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, and yet the graphs that you just saw, those terrifying graphs, remained what they were. Mm-hmm. So how come they couldn't at least make a small dent? In all but two, in the first 2 years of Clinton, there was a Democratic Congress, and only in the first 2 years of Obama was the Democratic Congress. So in all the other years of a Democratic presidency, there was Republican control of both the House and the Senate. So there was no way of getting legislation through. So, we talked a lot of ideas, but there is, at that moment, particularly in the 90s, the ideas of neoliberalism spread all around the world. So it was a cross-party, and Clinton did push financial market deregulation. Okay. And while the Democrats, we were talking about globalization, the Democrats said,
there ought to be trade adjustment assistance to the workers who lose their jobs. When the Republicans came back and said, no, we don't want, we want wages to go down, so we want the workers to suffer a little bit, the Democrats accepted those notions on the view that if there's enough growth, everybody will benefit, trickle-downs. They bought into the trickle-down theory, not all, but enough did, that they accepted that. And so in that sense, yeah, there was complicity. And then the same thing happened in Obama when in 2008, and I think that has a lot to do with the current political situation. In 2009, in responding to the crisis, even though Obama's chief of staff, Rob Emanuel, said you shouldn't let a crisis go to waste, he was too afraid of challenging the establishment, and he appointed the same people who had deregulated the financial system to save the banks. Mm-hmm. And they saved the banks, but didn't save the homeowners, didn't do very much for the workers. I was on a conference call right after Lehman Brothers collapsed, and the question was, what was going to be the Democratic Party response? And
what did you advise them?
Well, the proposal that was on the table was a $700 billion bailout to the banks. And most of the people on the conference call were from the financial sector, and their main question was, why only $700 billion? And the answer to that was, don't worry, if you need more money, we'll come up with it, but we thought $1 trillion looked too big. When I raised the question, you better spend a little bit of some money for the homeowners who are losing their homes and the workers who are going to be losing their jobs, the people from the financial sector said, shh, we're talking about serious things here.
This is big boys talking. Now,
so by any standard then, the elections that we are looking at in 2020 should be for the Democrats to lose. They have a big opportunity, if your analysis makes sense to a large part of the electorate, to win. So what is your recommendation to the Democratic Party going forward? And what candidate do you see most likely to be successful?
I said, that's a great question. In democratic politics in general, there are always two questions that you're balancing out. The voter turnout, particularly in the United States, typically is very low. And so if you could only get the people who agree with you to vote, you would win. And so part of the issue is, how do we get energy of the people who are our natural supporters to go out and vote, to campaign, so that's the issue of enthusiasm. The other issue is something called the median voter model. How do you attract the people in the middle to your view? And those two things are working against each other right now. That some of the people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders get enormous enthusiasm among younger people, among progressives, among people who are concerned about climate change. So they're really enthusiastic. The people in the middle dampen the enthusiasm, but are more appealing to the people in the middle. So that's a hard trade-off, and I think that no one really knows the answer to your question of how those two need to balance. What makes the issue more complicated in the United States than it would be in other countries is our system electoral college, where two of the three presidents of this century became president without winning a majority of the votes. Both Bush and Trump became presidents, even though a majority of people have voted for the Democratic candidate. The polls now show that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders would defeat Trump by millions of people if we had simple majority vote. But figuring out how it plays out in the electoral college is more complicated, partly because the polling is too thin to get results of it with any confidence.
Okay. So let's go more into detail on your agenda. You skipped the Green New Deal when you were talking to us earlier. Can you tell us a bit more about what's so appealing about the Green New Deal?
Well, first, as I said, I talked a lot about the inequality crisis, but we also are facing a climate crisis, which is recognized by everybody in the world except a fraction of one of the parties in the United States. But that's a problem because they're in control.
It's a powerful fraction.
So the question is, how do we address the issue of climate change, and how do we generate political support? So the Green New Deal was an idea that a lot of young Americans had, that we could use the green transition as a way of energizing our economy and our society. The New Deal was what FDR brought in response to the Great Depression, a big crisis, and it rejuvenated our economy. And so the idea is we'll bring this in and use that as a way, as a framework for rejuvenating our economy. So it's not a story just of sacrifice. Sometimes you hear, can we afford a green power transition? And this idea is that it would create jobs, it would make our economy more dynamic. It's trying to emphasize the positive aspects of a green transition.
And how would that play out? I mean, carbon taxes. What?
Oh, it would have a whole gamut of instruments. Investments is one of the things that we need: public investment, public infrastructure. It also is finance for private investments. So already in New York State, we have a green bank to provide money to facilitate the green transition. And this would create a national green bank that would provide money for households who want to insulate, to energy companies that want to retrofit. So it would help provide the finance. It would try to design regulations that would encourage and in some cases force a green transition. So one of the problems that we have in the United States is that some of our laws dealing with fiduciary responsibilities of pension funds and endowments say you have to look only at short-term returns, economic returns. And this would say, well, you're long-run institutions, you ought to be looking at the long run. And part of the long run is looking at the impact on the environment. So it's changing some of the legal frameworks that would encourage green. It would make corporations report their green risk. We're going to have a lot of stranded assets. It's going to be a very big disturbance to the economy, and companies ought to disclose that risk. So that's the kind of trying to make people be aware of the cost of not doing something. And finally, it will include a carbon tax, but it will be hopefully a much better managed than what happened in France with the yellow vest. So we're very sensitive about the distribution effects, and I think it's very clear that we have to make sure that the green transition has mostly winners.
It sounds as though you are itching to go. So if a year from now, President Elizabeth Warren gives you a call and offers you any job that you want in her administration, what do you choose?
Which job? Oh, I think, I like to, we would say in English, advise. being in one of these jobs is really a lot of work. And it's much more fun to tell other people what to do than to do it yourself. So
I agree. But the kind of advice that you would give, let's talk a little bit more about a fun topic, taxation. You are on record as having very outspoken views of what the best possible taxation system would be, and it would be based on a land value tax. And could you explain to us in broad terms what it would amount to, and would that be maybe a good idea even for the Netherlands?
Yeah. So I mean, that's only one part of the tax agenda, but it's an interesting one, and it goes back to the 19th century in the United States. There was the most famous American economist in the 19th century, not well known, probably elsewhere.
Henry George.
Is Henry George, and a very simple economic idea. You can tax labor and people might not work or they might leave the country. You could tax savings and they may not save as much. But if you tax the land in Manhattan, that land in Manhattan is not going to say, I'm going to go and become part of Canada. It's stuck in America. And so the idea that Henry George, in those who know economics, has said basically inelastic supply. So you can tax it without distortion, and it has a further advantage that because you tax the value of land, it encourages wealth to go into more productive investments, into new capital goods, into R&D, and to make a more productive economy. So it not only is non-distortionary, it actually encourages more productive investments. So I think it is a good idea.
How come it has never been seriously implemented?
Well, there are a lot of people who own land that don't like the idea. I think it's that simple. And there is a problem with transition that, you know, if you did it overnight, you would say, well, those who happen to put their wealth in land are paying more than those who happen to put their wealth in other forms. So the transition is not an easy transition.
We have an erfpacht debate in this city.
Yes.
And we'll remember your wise words.
Okay. Well, another of your proposals or solutions is not a universal basic income. You play with the idea in your book and then you discard it, say, well, it's not going to work. Can you tell us why?
Well, the universal basic income is an idea that has gotten a lot of resonance, for instance, in the Silicon Valley. I think it's a way of massaging their guilt. They think that there's going to be a lot of unemployment as a result of their advances in technology. And they say, don't worry, let's go back to the Roman solution of bread and circuses. We'll give everybody a little money, a few $1,000s, and they'll be happy. And the point that I make in the book is that for most people, not for every, work is an important part of their life. Mm-hmm. And even if it's not the most exciting work, they feel they're contributing to society, and it gives them a kind of dignity. And they don't want to just get a check every month. So, and you look at societies...
You could get a check and work still. I mean, it's not exclusive.
But you look at societies that have big grants, like Saudi Arabia. A lot of young men get a lot of money. They don't have to work. It's not the kind of society I think that most of us think is the most successful society. So some of my younger students say I'm very 20th century. They don't need to work, they say. They're perfectly willing to have spiritual life of contemplation and just give them the check.
That would never happen here. I was just listening to you again and wondering about the implications of your various ideas. You have one proposal in your book where the Netherlands might help you a little bit, which is where you suggest that government should offer a job to everybody who cannot easily find a job in the private sector. And this is an experiment that we have run on your behalf. They were called Melkert jobs. So here we have a potential advisor to you in case you get the opportunity to run Elizabeth Warren's administration. And the reason that it didn't work so well is that it was very hard to persuade people to move from these jobs to what you might think of as regular jobs. And so basically they got stuck, and at the end of the day, the net result was very disappointing. And most of these jobs and most systems creating them have by now disappeared. What makes you optimistic that this could really work?
Well, I mean, you're right. It's not an easy job to craft this kind of program. And in the book, I say, you know, if we can get our labor market to work well, so that we get full employment through monetary and fiscal policy, then this is a second best. But so far, our labor market hasn't worked well. The unemployment rate, say, for African American young youth is 4 times the national average. And so we will probably need to intervene if we're going to get them included, these groups that have been excluded, to get them included in the labor market. And it's an important social agenda as well as an economic agenda. Now, obviously, you have to design the programs with an objective of moving people into other jobs. And that means you have to think about, as you design it, maybe having partnerships with private firms. And you're taking on a lot of burden of training, but it's an active training program. And thinking about making sure they're learning skills that are valuable in the rest of the economy. I mean, obviously, if you don't train them for skills for jobs that don't exist, then the program is not going to work. Mm-hmm. But there's been, and you may have to limit the scale of the program. But one of the things I point out that India, which is relatively poor country, has had a rural employment guarantee scheme involving 800 million people in the rural sector, and it's worked relatively well. The main criticism is that wages in the rural sector have gone up, and the employers in the rural sector don't like that. But the intent of the program was to increase living standards in the rural sector, and it actually did that. It's a guarantee not of a full-time job. It's 100 days a year, and that gives them a backstop if the market doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Okay. One of the other things you were talking about is the concentration of power in Silicon Valley. Would you be in favor of breaking up Facebook, for instance? Would
Yes.
we need to do that? Google, break them up?
Well, Facebook, there was no reason that we should have allowed Facebook to acquire Instagram and WhatsApp. Mm-hmm. That was clearly a concentration of market power. Why? It was so obvious when they paid so much for Instagram, where they have the technology to produce the same kind of thing. Why did they pay so much for it? Because they were
buying the users.
They were buying the users, but more than that, they were preempting competition.
Right.
That was really what this was about. And so they wanted to make sure there wasn't competition. And a good antitrust authority would have said, no, you can't do that. So that's the case where breaking it up would help. But there is a natural monopoly on some of these platforms. It's going to be very difficult to break up Google and Facebook. So then you have to go to regulate their practices. So there's no reason that Google needs to go into becoming a store, an online store. There are enormous conflicts of interest that have been exposed by the competition authorities in Europe. Mm-hmm. There's no reason to have those conflicts of interest. And so that's an example. In the case of Facebook, we have laws about consumer protection. Facebook agreed to respect privacy. And then what did it do? ignored that agreement, and it got fined $5 billion. So those are examples of where you need regulations, but we haven't yet gotten the kind of regulations that you have in Europe. And just a couple of weeks ago, Zuckerberg testified that he's going to allow lies about politics all over the Facebook. It's okay if you lie about what your some opponent's position is, and you confuse voters.
Yep.
I think we can't allow that kind of political manipulation as part. It played a role in 2016, and unless we have better regulation, it's going to play a role in elections all over the world.
So that would imply, would it not, a form of a priori censorship on what could appear on Facebook?
It's not censorship, but it's accountability. Why is there all of these bad activities going on the internet? In part, it was because the internet company, the tech companies in the beginning said, to get us going, you have to give us freedom from liability. Newspapers, if they published the same things, would be liable. They'd be sued. There's a difference between a newspaper and the internet, but that freedom from liability gave them a license to be irresponsible. Now, we have restrictions on free speech all the time. You can't cry fire in a crowded theater. You can't engage in childhood pornography. The question is, to make our society function, where we draw the boundary. Germany has passed laws about hate speech. And it's very clear that different societies are drawing the boundaries in different ways. 15 years ago, 10 years ago, before Trump, nobody thought there was an issue about using the internet to manipulate an election in the way that has actually happened. And that is beginning to force us to begin to debate, where do we draw the line? I don't have the answer, but what I think is very clear, saying everything goes is going to be very dangerous for our democracy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll come to the last question. Alexander.
I'm going to sneak in two questions, if I may. Really benefit from your presence here. First of all, to benefit from your presence here in Europe. When we were in the middle of our economic crisis, you came out very critically against austerity politics. And at some point, you referred to it as a suicide pact. And you spoke on behalf of countries like Greece and Spain that were caught in a terrible bind. And my first question to you would be, can you give us any advice on how we should prepare for the next recession, if and when it should come? And how your advice is influenced by the fact that we seem to be heading for a period with very low, if not zero, real interest rates. Development that, according to some people, should ask for a real re-evaluation of what macroeconomics is really all about.
So that's a really good question. Let me say first that even those countries who believe in the fiscal restraint, 3% deficit, there's a widespread view that when the interest rate gets down to zero and you can't stimulate it, then you have to use other tools, and you have to use fiscal policy. So there's always a debate about the mix of fiscal and monetary policy, but when monetary policy isn't working, there's only one thing left, and the cost of not using fiscal policy is very great. So I feel very strongly that there should be a reform in the Growth and Stability Pact, And the minimal reform would be the one I just described, that exception. But I think, if you ask where did that 3% number come from, it was pulled out of thin air. It was not based on any economic science. It was just a number that somebody thought of. It had no scientific basis to it. And particularly when you ask the question, the deficit looks at one side of the balance sheet of the country, and that's the liability side. You really want to look simultaneously. No firm would you ever look at just the liability side of the balance sheet. You would always want to look at the asset side. So if you ask, what if we got more debt, but we spent the money on investments, on infrastructure, on technology, on education, then the balance sheet could be stronger. The country is actually in a better position. It's wealthier. Now, one of the big issues that obviously a lot of people in the audience feel strongly about is the climate crisis. And so another change that is being discussed in some countries in Europe is called the Green Rule. And that says if you're going to spend the money on green investments, you should be allowed to go over that 3% target. So Europe has been committed to doing something about climate change. But what are the tools? How is it going to do it? And this would be one way of incentivizing, and particularly countries like Italy that have no fiscal space. And this would allow them to return to economic growth and make a contribution to creating a greener Europe. Finally, I think there are really the countries in Europe that have fiscal space, that is to say, who don't have a high debt, who have the borrowing capacity, like Germany. I think
I can think of another one.
Yeah,
Small one.
I think should really be using that fiscal space, not only for their own well-being, but for the well-being of Europe as a whole. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is an agenda that can help restore. This is related to one of the questions about the weaknesses in Europe. This would do more than almost anything else to restore growth to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
I was hoping that you'd say something like that. My final question, and your final sentence in the book is something like, let's hope it's not too late for capitalism to save it from itself. And my question really is, what would happen if it doesn't? Is there a plan B? And if so, what is it? Or maybe more bluntly, should we send our children to prepare for their own future to Beijing or to Boston?
I hope you don't have to send them to either place, because I hope Europe will, I would say as Americans, we're looking much more to Europe as our salvation. You may be growing more slowly, but you're growing more together. And it wasn't as clear on some of the charts as it could have been. But the fact is that this divide that's opening up in the United States, which is the economic, social, and political divide, is very corrosive of our whole society. So you ask, what happens if we don't? All we can say is, I pray. That I think it's very hard to see how our whole society can hang together. So I think my hope is that somewhere in the world, and right now the best prospect is Europe, there are countries that come to understand that you can't have sustainable prosperity without having shared prosperity. And you also have to attack the climate issue, and that's a global issue. But the fundamental is you can't have sustainable prosperity without shared prosperity.